Happy to see you here. My name is Dongchoon Kim. I'm a professor of Songgong University in Seoul. I will briefly talk about the Korean War massacre and human rights violences during the Korean War, how Korean society faced the kind of human rights violences during the Korean War, and how the victims' family members have been suffered since then, and how we try to research or investigate the past wrongdoings. This year marks the 69th anniversary of the ceasefire of the Korean War in 1953 in this month, July 27. And next year will be the 70th anniversary of the ceasefire of the Korean War. The national division since then still exists in Korean Peninsula, you know. There were several countries divided after the Second World War, Germany and Vietnam, Korea and Yemen. And, you know, the Germany reunified in 1989. Vietnam reunified by North Vietnamese invasion, and through the Civil War, eventually in 1975, Korean people still divided in North Korea and South Korea. It is a long national division. If we understand why Korean Peninsula could not achieve reunification, we should understand the Korean War. The differences between Germany and Korea lie in the very occurrence of the civil war between two countries. And officially, you know, Cold War ended in Europe, but in East Asia, the Cold War by other forms still exists. Still officially in mainland China is the communist country, and North Korea is still communist country, and Vietnam still officially is the communist country. So by this Russian-Ukraine war, still new kind of Cold War may begin by this war, but we don't know whether this kind of war develop into new kind of Cold War. But still, we are suffering from the old Korean War. So Korean War is still technically exists in Korean Peninsula. This picture you may already see in the Pablo Picasso's The Genocide in Korea. This picture was made just 1951. Pablo Picasso was the famous left-wing artist at the time. In Europe, there were some rumor about the Korean War. The Americans killed innocent North Koreans and South Koreans. And based on this kind of rumor, and Pablo Picasso portrayed this kind of picture. You can see the American troops here and Korean people and women and men and children is the nude Korean people. That kind of news was generally known to French and other European leftists. By leftist media, I don't exactly know how they can get the information about the Korean War. But the news about the Korean War was strictly prohibited by the foreigners. And so that kind of mass killing, can you say it is a genocide or not? Some controversial point. But at the time, in Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, there was some discussion about how can you understand the character of the Korean War. Yeah, at the time, Europeans could not understand the real character of the Korean War. It was just a kind of national liberation war called by North Koreans because Korean Peninsula was officially liberated from the Japanese occupation in 1945. But there were two countries from 1948 in South Korea and North Korea. And so the Korean War was not just a one-sided invasion, but this was a kind of imperialist design to disrupt the national liberation of the Korean people. It was the official viewpoints of the leftists, of the Europeans. There are still conflicting viewpoints and naming of the Korean War. In South Korea, it's the kind of anti-communist crusade. Korean first president Lee Seung-man called this war is a kind of crusade against communists. South Korean president since then and South Korean people generally learn the character of the Korean War like this. Even the post-Korean War generations like me and our children still think about the Korean War, a kind of one-sided invasion of the North Korea. And so it's the solidarity and between UN, United States and Korea and the liberal camp in the world fought against communist camp. They mean it's the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea. And this kind of naming and characterization still exists in South Korean politics and ideology. And national security law still exists in South Korea. If I support North Korea, I may be arrested in violating the national security law. So we are not free to talk about the general characteristics of the Korean War. It is because national division and national security law in South Korea. Anyway, June 25 is the general naming of the Korean War, the very day North Korea invaded South Korea. We should remember the North Korea's one-sided invasion. So we should call the war June 25. But North Korea officially called the war National Liberation War. National Liberation War means South Korea was still occupied by Japanese collaborators and those who supported imperialism. And American imperialism still occupy South Korea. So we should liberate South Koreans from the shackle of U.S. imperialism. This is the official naming of North Koreans of the war. And China called this war is the assistance North Korea for anti-America. China involved in the war from October of the 1950. So many Chinese soldiers were victimized during the war. So it was under the cause of their close friend, North Korea. This is also an official naming of the Korean War by Chinese. You may say the Korean War was a forgotten war, forgotten by Westerners. Korean War occurred in 1950. It was in the early phase of the Cold War. And Korea was a very small country, isolated, extreme east. And Westerners, they were not interested in Korea. Even during the Korean War, Western media did not cover fully the very occurrence and sequence of the war. This was a very different thing. You may figure out how Russia-Ukraine war covered global media. But the civil war in Korea, like the other civil war in the third world, the Westerners are not generally interested in that kind of war. In this sense, the Korean War still named as a forgotten war, but the forgotten they mean is very, very complex war because quite confusing about who first invaded and why the war occurred. What the meaning and the result of the war is quite confusing. Even today, when we compare to the Vietnamese War, Vietnamese War was also a kind of civil war and became developed into the global war. But Vietnamese War was very well known to Americans and Westerners because it was high time of human rights. And 68 revolution occurred in Europe and United States. And young generations at that time opposed the Vietnamese War, immoral war, they called. So Vietnamese War became popular, even the very occurrence of the war. But Korean War, it was a very early phase of the Korean Cold War, and anti-communism and U.S. hegemony was very, very strong. And so Americans and Europeans could not have any room to understand, to pay attention to this kind of war in the very small country in the Far East because they were recovering from the devastation of the Second World War. And so there are several kinds of naming and characterization of the Korean War still exist. So now I'm going to talk about the untold chapter of the Korean War. Still, you can learn much about the third chapter of the Korean War. Korean War occurred in 1950 and not ended, but ceasefire in 1953. 3 years war during the long negotiation of the ceasefire and eventually re-divided by the ceasefire. During this war, originally North Korea invaded South Korea and South Korean government fought against North Korea. And early period of the Korean War, U.S. involved in the Korean War under the command of the UN, crossed over the 38 parallel. They moved to the North Korea, and Chinese government and Chinese Mao Zedong involved in the war. And so they moved south. And several times the border and front line moved from north and south several times. And eventually we reached to the ceasefire. This is generally known story of the Korean War. But today I'm going to say the untold chapter and unknown chapter of the Korean War is the civilian level, second front line, the People's War against each other. Not just leftists and rightists, but there are very complex background. Why Koreans fought against each other. Why Koreans killed even their family members by the ideology. We can understand the Korean War through the viewpoints of the post-colonial conflict. This is the very big difference from Korea and Germany. Germany was the perpetrator of the invasion of neighboring countries in the Second World War. And Korea was the colonized country in 1945, before 1945. And after 1945, Korea was situated in the way to the national independence. And the new unified government they tried to build. And Koreans fought against Japanese before 1945 in order to build independent, new democratic government. But after 1945, when Japanese moved to their home country, a kind of political vacuum was made in Korean Peninsula. In this post-colonial period, some conflict, not just in Korea, but other countries who liberated from the German, Japan, and other imperialist countries like Greece in Europe, Vietnam, Taiwan, Korea, and other South Asian countries. When Japan surrendered, they tried to build their independent country. But when they wanted to build their country, some conflict in their countrymen, among the people, by leftists and rightists. Those who fought against imperialists and those who supported imperialism. And this kind of post-colonial conflict occurred in every country in Asia, Africa, and other regions. In Korea, there are two dimensions of conflict. First, leftist and rightist. Second, national liberation forces and those who supported imperialists. This very complex one to understand. Not all leftists were national liberators. Not all rightists was imperialist supporters. But generally, leftists were involved in the national independence movement. And generally, rightists are involved in the pro-Japanese officials and policemen. So this kind of civil war occurred just in 1989 in South Korea with the famous Jeju April 3rd rebellion. And Yeosun is the two cities in Yeosu and Suncheon in South Korea. In these two places, Korean army rebelled against South Korean government. They opposed when the Korean government ordered them to go to Jeju to suppress the leftists. So they rebelled against the kind of order. This kind of Yeosun rebellion was led by leftist soldiers. In civil war in Yeosu and Jeju, so many civilians were killed, and policemen and their family members were killed by leftists. Some pro-Japanese person were killed by a leftist person in Jeju and Yeosun. This kind of civil war occurred in Taiwan. In Taiwan, February 28 incident occurred in 1947 and 48, and very similar kind of civil war and massacre occurred in South Korea, Taiwan, and Greece, and 1965 in Indonesia, and 1971 in Bangladesh, in 1973 or some other place in Africa. very, very similar kind of post-colonial conflict. I can categorize several kinds of massacres just occurred during the Korean War. The massacre was generally committed by South Korean authorities and U.S. forces, and partly committed by North Korean authorities and South Korean grassroots raptists across the Korean peninsula. One most important cases would be killings on the National Guidance League members, just very, very early phase of the Korean War. National Guidance League members was the converted communists who once involved in communist movements and those who were involved in anti-Lee Seung-man government movement. They were suspected communists. When North Korea invaded South Korea, South Korean Lee Seung-man government suddenly arrested the National Guidance League members and killed the very, very tragic mass killings in the early period of the Korean War. Another kinds of massacre I can say is when North Korea invaded South Korea. For about 3 months, South Koreans, they have no choice but to support North Korean system. So when North Korea moved north, they were also suspected communists. So their family members were killed by South Korean authorities. And U.S. ground forces and U.S. air forces, by strafing and bombing against Korean refugees, generally in the early period of the Korean War. And other kinds of massacre when North Korean forces moved to north by the attack of the United States, they killed the South Korean people, South Korean rightists and their family members. It's a mutual killing occurred by Koreans among civilians. You can see the map of the Korean War. And the 38th parallel, there are some categorization of the mass killings I mentioned. One is the National Guidance League members killing, and second, North Korean People's Army collaborators killing, and third, National Guidance League members plus communist collaborators killings. Number 4 place, the victims of suppressions by army and police. Number 4 is the Jiri Mountain areas where North Korean forces and South Korean guerrilla forces stationed in the place, and some people around the Jirisan mountain supported the guerrilla forces. You can see the photo taken not by Koreans but U.S. forces. You can imagine how the massacre was like. You can see the Korean soldiers and army shot them in the bank. Then they were covered by sun. Since then, about 50 or 60 years after the mass killing, you can see the truck. On the truck, you can see Korean soldiers. You can see the political prisoners just forcibly moved some places in Middle Korea. In Kongju, and several hundreds prisoners were killed. This is just before the killing. This photo was taken by English journalist James Cameron. After taking this picture, he was laid off by this photo. I heard you may visit in Nogunri. You can see the Nogunri is the U.S. Army-related massacres occurred in Nogunri. But Nogunri incident was the tip of the iceberg. And there are numerous killings by U.S. air bombing and strafing. But Nogunri was the only cases that were known by U.S. officials. After the occurrence of the Nogunri incident, U.S. officials went to the Nogunri and reported, but numerous similar kind of incidents. When I was standing commissioner of the TRSK, I investigated numerous kind of another Nogunri. Anyway, and Nogunri incident became the global issue after 2000 because global media and AP reported the Nogunri incident. And this is why Nogunri became the internationally well-known incident during the Korean War. But global media contributed much. Nogunri incident make known to the global public, but other incident was still unknown to the global public. As I mentioned, the Korean War was very, very complex war. I mean, not just conflict between right and left, communists and liberals, but this war was a kind of U.S. involved maybe in the first war after 1945 in the third world countries. Not just the mass killing against the civilians, there are several kinds of victimization by women and racist components of the war. U.S. soldiers against not just North Koreans, but Korean in general. So there exists a kind of Orientalism of the U.S. Army against the Koreans, then yellow people. This kind of racism you can see in the Vietnamese War and the Afghanistan War. But Korean War may be the first case the U.S. participated in the war of the Third World, I think. This photo testified how the war was like. You can see the imbalance of the power and the youth of the North Korean army. As I said, massacres by North Korean occupiers. North Koreans occupied South Korean territory about 3 months, and different from their region in Seoul is about 3 months, and other southern South Korea is the 1 month or even 1 week. Except in Busan and Daejeon, remaining places. And this photo taken in Jeonju prison, the North Korean army killed many Korean rightist family members. Yeah, very tragic photo, easily taken by U.S. soldiers. U.S. soldiers take many of these kind of photos in order to sue the North Korea as the war criminal. I want to explain the backgrounds of the causes of the massive violences in the Korean War. Long background, maybe the post-colonial civil war context, as I mentioned. Okay, second one is the colonial legacies. Korean police and army was generally Japanese trained police and military. So this is why North Koreans hold the war as a national liberation in order to eradicate the South Korean colonial remnants, Japanese trained police and military. There are another aspects of the class conflict, the landlord and tenants. The long class conflict in North Korea and South Korea. Generally, landlord was Japanese supporters, pro-Japanese, and tenants were suffered from the kind of Japanese colonialism and landlord. And why North Korea invaded South Korea? In order to make South Korea as a communist country is one explanation. Another most important explanation is the fever of nationalism. Fever of nationalism, I mean anti-Japanese sentiments against Japanese collaborator and anti-American sentiment, I think, is a kind of national socialism. And ideological extremity is the early Cold War period, you can figure out. And anti-communism, anti-Americanism was highest at the time. And racism, I also mentioned, especially U.S. military leaders and soldiers. The commanders and ordinary soldiers have similar kinds of racism against Koreans, I think. And another point is geopolitics. Korean Peninsula is situated in the Far East, very long distance from Westerners. These several kinds of components background caused this kind of mass killings, and Korean War became a known war until now. And eventually ceasefire among third parties, North Korea's Kim Il-sung, Chinese Peng Deok-hye, and U.S. military. These third party made an agreement of ceasefire, and if want to end the Korean War, these three groups come together and make another agreement. You cannot see the South Korea. South Korean authorities was under the command of UN. So this is why South Korea could not be a subject of ceasefire. This is why North Koreans still try to dialogue with America, not South Korea, because United States is their partner to negotiate over the dialogue of Korea's reunification or peace. Okay, and after demise of the Cold War or democratization, and how Korean society memorize the Korean War. If you visit Jeju, it's a very beautiful island in southern Korea. It's a kind of dark tourism. You can see some places like this, where an epitaph of the victims was demolished by South Korean military in 1961. In 1956, Jeju victims' family members built this kind of epitaph, but Korean military government was afraid of being known to that kind of massacre to Korean people. So they demolished and the epitaph. And after democratization, the victims' family members and gathered the broken epitaph, and they made this kind of new memorial place in Jeju. This photo, this place demonstrate how the remembering the Korean War is like in Korean context. 1987, after democratization, there appeared new studies on the Korean War. Old studies is the traditional viewpoints. Traditional, is Cold War perspectives. Cold War perspectives and North Korea, under the support of Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, and it's a kind of crusade against communism, the official narratives. But after 1987, this kind of official narratives was attacked by new studies. Bruce Cummings and Wada Haruki in Japan, Bang Myung-lim in Korea, and me in 전쟁과 사회, War and Society. And this kind of new studies appeared in 1990. In the recovering the memory of the Korean War, and the Korean War truth-finding initiated since then. And the left photo shows in 1960 in Daegu, just when South Korean authoritarian leader in the Lee Seung-man government collapsed, the victims' family members come together and cry to ask for justice. You can see the most of the women, the mother and wives of the victims, asked for justice and crying for justice in 1960. After 2000, personally I involved in the movements. Some civic groups come together to make a kind of testimony by the victims. We persuaded the victims to talk about and speak out your victimization. I presided over this kind of meeting in 2001. Since then, there occurred some movements of Korean War fact-finding, and in order to resolve the victimization of the victims. Anyway, and after then, personally, I involved in the Truth Commission's 2005. We exhumed the very place. The left photo shows the Kongju. You may visit Kongju, but you cannot see this kind of place. But at the very time of exhumation, we took photo about how the mass killing was like. I personally, in the media report in 2007, 6, I don't remember exact year, to explain to the Korean media and international media about the Korean War massacres at the time. And so we also exhumation in Daejeon. Daejeon is the center of the South Korea, and about at least 3,000 civilians were killed in Daejeon. I can show you some steps of TR's case investigation. We get application from the victims and investigation and deliberation process. And after our decision, we recommend to the Korean government, to the Korean president and National Assembly to recovering the dignity of the victims. And we also find some new materials, testimonies, and documents about the Korean War, and documents of the police, some list of the victims, collaborators. Collaborators mean is the collaborators of North Korean system. We also found some U.S. documents about the U.S. air bombing, and written documents about activities of the U.S. Air Forces. You may know no perpetrators remain exact data or written testimony about the commitment against civilians. So we can guess by the activities of the army and police. We can guess if the kind of activities match the victim testimony. We decide, okay, at that place, at the very date, very place, some kinds of killings occurred. What the Korean War left to the two divided countries by the Korean War. in South Korea in hyper or pro-Americanism and anti-communism. After 1953, and even after the democratization, still anti-North Koreanism, anti-Kim Il-sung sentiments still pervade in South Korean public, and the military dictatorship sustained and rated for 27 years, from 1961 to 1987, because military became very, very strong and very large, very, very dominant groups in South Korea politics. And some positive points I can mention: fast capitalist economic development, because labor movements and socialism were almost eradicated in South Korean politics. And some socialists and communists moved to North Korea. So South Korean politics was quite easier for politicians to mobilize the Korean public toward the economic development. No opposition from the labor activism. This kind of politics contribute to some extent the fast economic development of South Korea. But trauma still remains, not of the victims, but ordinary Koreans. Some kind of trauma, including me, who served Korean military, have some kind of trauma by violence. Violence in school, violence in military, violence in everyday life, maybe partly related to the Korean War and Korean War system in South Korea. And similar kind of thing exists in North Korea: hyper anti-Americanism and hyper strong nationalist socialism was caused by the Korean. They were proud of themselves because they won the war against the strongest country in the world, United States. This is their pride, North Korean pride. And that kind of pride of North Korean leaders have been shared by ordinary North Koreans, I think. And it's the one-man rule, 주체 ideology, and inheritance of the ruling system, maybe partly related to Korean Confucian culture and partly from the Korean. And the Westerners cannot understand why North Korea still have that kind of feudal, the one-man of inheritance system. Okay, this is remnant of Confucianism, but I want to emphasize the legacy or the political isolation of North Koreans make ordinary North Koreans support the Kim Il-sung family. And the self-reliance system as isolation of North Korea and strong support their system came from the experience and memory of the Korean. And recently, new studies on the Korean War and new trend in understanding the Korean War, I want to introduce you in the 마을로간 한국전쟁 in Korean War in the village level. The village level is the mutual killings by ordinary Koreans in the village. And another studies of the air bombing and 폭격, U.S. Air bombing against Koreans during the Korean War is the very important studies. And the origin of the Panmunjom system is what the meaning of the ceasefire and how can understand U.S. foreign policy by the Korean ceasefire. The order called is the Panmunjom system. The Panmunjom system is the Korean national division system. And another several studies and gender studies through the spectrum of the comfort woman issue. Some comfort woman existed during the Korean War. This is very uncomfortable stories about the Korean War, but some scholars investigate that kind of thing occurred during the Korean War. And the role of the Christians, how Christians and church involved in mass killings. And Christians and non-Christians conflict also existed in the Korean War. By this non-Christians conflict, we can understand hyper anti-communism of the Korean Christian leaders, and especially in mega churches in Korea. And so we can explain the mega churches, hyper anti-communism of the Korean Christian leaders, we can explain by their experience of the Korean War. There are many memory of the stories released recently since 2010, and many written books about the hidden stories of the family members of the victimization. Unfortunately, these stories translated in English and other languages, but many stories we can find here in Korea. Finally, I want to say, to ending the Korean War, last Moon Jae-in government, we were amused to meeting of Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in in Panmunjom. They tried to end the Korean War, but eventually it was disrupted and failed. Moon Jae-in government tried their best to negotiate between North Korea and United States in Vietnam and some other places, but eventually we failed to end the Korean War. And some scholars in the United States, Korean scholars, campaigned to end the Korean War, not just in Korea, but in America. They opposed the U.S. militarism and racial violences, not just in Korea, but in other Asian countries. Ending the Korean War may be the crucial turning point to make peace in Asia and in the world. This is why some scholars in America, mostly in Korean American, second generations, they campaigned to the U.S. National Assembly to reach an agreement to end the Korean War since 2018 until now. And this is a letter I will introduce you. Second generation Koreans in the United States will make their effort to Korean Policy Institute in the United States campaigned to end the Korean War. Okay, this kind of written letter to me. Okay, thank you very much.